London 1665. Close your eyes and forget everything you think you know about the city. Forget the grandeur. Forget the empire. Forget the ordered streets and the celebrated architecture. What I'm about to show you is a London that existed in a state of biological warfare, not against an enemy nation, but against an invisible predator that turned the greatest city in Europe into an open-air crematorium. Narrow streets so tight that neighbors could touch hands across the gap between buildings. No running water, no sewage system. Human waste thrown from windows into streets already carpeted with animal carcasses, rotting vegetables, and the accumulated filth of 500,000 people crammed into less than 1 square mile. The smell alone would have driven you to your knees, but Londoners had grown numb to it. They had no choice. This was simply life in the most powerful city on earth. The air itself was a living thing, thick, humid, carrying particles of decay that settled on your skin, your food, your children's faces as they slept. Every breath was a gamble, every meal a potential last supper. But in January of 1665, as frost hardened the filth into something almost bearable, nobody knew that the greatest catastrophe in London's history had already begun its countdown. The Thames, that great artery of commerce and connection, had become a highway for death. Ships arrived daily from plague-ravaged European ports, their holds packed not just with exotic goods and spices, but with silent passengers that required no passport and paid no customs duty. Rats. Thousands upon thousands of rats, their bodies hosting fleas, and those fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would soon rename London as the City of the Dead.
This invasion is paramount to our interests.
In the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, something peculiar was happening that January, though nobody recognized it for what it was. The poorest neighborhood in London, where immigrants, beggars, and the forgotten huddled in structures that barely deserved the name housing, was experiencing what officials dismissively labeled spotted fever. A few deaths here and there. Nothing unusual for St. Giles, where poverty killed more reliably than any disease. But these deaths were different. They came with agony that defied description, swellings in the groin and armpits that grew to the size of apples, skin turning black as tissue died from within, fever so intense that victims threw themselves into the streets begging for water that would never quench the fire consuming them from inside. And the smell, dear God, the smell, a sweetness mixed with rot that announced death before it arrived. The authorities did what authorities have always done when confronted with problems among the poor. They looked away. These were disposable people in a disposable neighborhood. Let them die quietly. London had trade to conduct, money to make, appearances to maintain. By March, the frost had released its grip. Spring warmth awakened more than flowers. In the dark spaces beneath floorboards, inside walls, within the fabric of the city itself, biological forces stirred. Rat populations exploded, fleas bred with obscene efficiency, and the plague, patient and perfect in its design, began to spread in a mathematical progression that would have terrified anyone who understood exponential growth. 2 deaths became 4, 4 became 8. 8 became 16. Within weeks, the progression became unstoppable. But London's leadership, composed of merchants and nobles who lived in the cleaner western districts, continued their magnificent charade of normalcy. Parliament met, markets operated, churches held services where hundreds breathed the same contaminated air for hours. By May, denial became impossible. The bills of mortality, weekly death counts published by the parish clerks, began showing numbers that couldn't be explained away. Not just in St. Giles anymore, but spreading east into Holborn, south toward the river, creeping inexorably toward the wealthy districts like a rising tide that respected no walls or wealth. In a city overrun with rats, London's leaders decided to kill the only natural predators keeping the rat population in check. They ordered the systematic slaughter of tens of thousands of cats and dogs. Killers went street to street, club and blade in hand. executing household pets while their owners wept. The streets ran with the blood of animals whose only crime was existing in a city ruled by ignorance.
Gentlemen, the crisis demands divine intervention. I propose we decree a national day of prayer and fasting.
Within weeks, the consequences became catastrophic. Without cats hunting them, without dogs disturbing their nests, rats multiplied beyond counting. They moved freely through every building, every warehouse, every home. They bred in the walls of palaces and hovels alike. And wherever they went, their fleas went with them, jumping from rat to human, biting, injecting, killing. June brought heat, real heat, the kind that made the already unbearable stench of London into something that drove people to madness. Garbage rotted faster, bodies decomposed in hours rather than days. And still, the city's leaders insisted on maintaining commerce. The king suggested a day of prayer, as if divine intervention would arrive to destroy bacteria that had been perfecting their craft for thousands of years. The policy was simple, brutal, and utterly medieval. If anyone in a household showed signs of plague, the entire family would be locked inside. A red cross was painted on the door, along with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Guards were posted to ensure nobody escaped. Food would be left outside if anyone remembered to bring it.
Please, Doctor, you must save
The screams from these marked houses became London's new soundtrack. People threw themselves from windows. They tried to bribe guards. They begged for death rather than the torture of slow contamination. Families turned on each other in the delirium of fever. Children were found days after death, still clutching the bodies of parents who had stopped breathing. You've seen the images, those haunting figures in long waxed coats and leather gloves, faces hidden behind masks with grotesque curved beaks. They look like creatures from nightmare, and in many ways they were. The beak was filled with herbs and perfumes based on the miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air. If you couldn't smell the sickness, the logic went, you couldn't catch it. But they were also the only medical presence willing to enter plague houses. For enormous fees, they would examine patients, lance buboes with unsterilized instruments, prescribe treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful, bloodletting to balance the humors, poultices of onions and butter, amulets containing arsenic, instructions to hold live chickens against the swellings to draw out the poison. None of it worked. How could it? These doctors didn't understand germ theory because germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 2 centuries. They were operating with medical knowledge that was essentially medieval, fighting a bacterial enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't defeat. By August, London had become unrecognizable. The wealthy had fled. Those who could afford country estates abandoned the city en masse, taking their servants and possessions and leaving the poor to face the catastrophe alone. The king himself left for Oxford, his departure a signal that London was now considered lost. 7,000 people died in 1 week, then 8,000, then 9,000. The bills of mortality stopped being printed with individual names. There were simply too many. Bodies were categorized by parish, age, and cause, reduced to data points in a nightmare census. The death carts began their rounds at nightfall. "Bring out your dead," the cry echoed through empty streets, and from the marked houses came the bodies, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, sometimes naked, often already decomposing in the August heat. They were thrown onto carts like cordwood, stacked with no ceremony, no prayer, no acknowledgement that these had been human beings with names and dreams and people who loved them. The plague pits grew wider and deeper. Mass grave on the edge of the city swallowed thousands. Layers of bodies covered with quicklime, then more bodies, then more lime, until the pits were filled and new ones had to be dug. The earth itself seemed to reject them. Gases from decomposition caused the ground to swell and crack, releasing stenches that made even hardened gravediggers vomit. September was the peak. The plague was killing over 10,000 people per week in a city whose remaining population numbered perhaps 200,000. 1 in 20 Londoners was dying every 7 days. The mathematics of extinction was simple. At this rate, London would be completely depopulated within 6 months.
It's spreading to the next house.
Get the water, quickly!
But something else was coming, something no one expected, something that would prove more destructive and more redemptive than any policy, any prayer, any medicine. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666. A spark, an oven not properly extinguished, flames spreading through the wooden building, then to the next, then the next. In a city built almost entirely of timber and thatch, packed so tightly that buildings touched each other across narrow lanes, fire didn't spread, it erupted. For 4 days, London burned. The Great Fire consumed 4/5 of the city, destroying over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the medieval infrastructure that had stood for centuries. It should have been the final catastrophe, the death blow to an already dying city. The fire accomplished what medicine, policy, and prayer could not. It incinerated the rats' nests. It destroyed the contaminated timber, the filth-soaked thatch, the plague-harboring debris of centuries. It sterilized whole neighborhoods with temperatures that killed every flea, every rat, every trace of Yersinia pestis. By the time the flames died, From the ashes rose a new London, built in brick and stone, with wider streets and better planning, with spaces for air to circulate and sunlight to reach. It was accident and urban planning combined, destruction and rebirth. The most devastating fire in English history had saved the capital from complete extinction.
According to these figures, the project is still on schedule.
Good, let's review
London
the
learned
next
its
phase
lesson
deliverable
in
this
ashes
afternoon.
and mass grave. The question is, will we learn ours before history is forced to teach us the same way? I hope this story has made you think, made you question, made you see the past as something more than dates and death tolls. If it has, please share this video. And don't forget to subscribe. History is watching, and it has more stories to tell.